I lost my 21-year-old daughter in 2009, which devastated my world like a massive earthquake. I sought out a grief counselor, even though I was a grief counselor myself, and attended a support group for parents who had lost children. I also read numerous books on grief and loss, trying to make sense out of the emotional chaos I was experiencing. One book, Grieving Mindfully by Samit Kumar, offered a mindful approach to grieving, which I found helpful. Now I wish to share with you what I learned while grieving from the inside out. Grieving can be visualized as climbing a spiral staircase. As we climb through each spiral of the staircase, we pass through phases of acute grief and subtle grief. Acute grief is when grief dominates our consciousness, and it may be all we can do just to get through the moment, hour, or day. Subtle grief occupies the times between periods of acute grief, when we are functioning once again, but the shadow of loss is always at our side. After a major loss, acute grief is what we usually experience the most, but eventually we begin to experience periods of subtle grief that may seduce us into thinking we have finished grieving. But then in an instant we can be swept back into acute grief and feel like we're starting all over again. This surrealistic experience of doing well and then suddenly feeling overwhelmed is quite confusing, particularly if we're used to feeling in control of our emotions. Eventually, however, we may come to realize that we're dealing with something we may have never experienced before, living life through the prism of major loss. As we climb the spiral staircase, we may come to realize that our grieving has a rhythm that we should not ignore. We may come to learn that we can function only so long before we have to feel our feelings of loss, which then will allow us to return to functioning for a while. We may observe that as we ascend the spiral staircase, the periods of acute grief become more manageable as we learn to expect them and not fight them. We may learn to embrace acute grief as part of a process in which we transform our love for our departed loved one into new avenues of meaning and purpose, which lies at the very heart of healing. Grieving a devastating loss requires a delicate balancing act. After the initial overwhelming shock of the loss, we eventually realize that we have to pay our bills, raise our children, and get back to taking care of ourselves. Somehow we must find a way back to life, but not the same life, but the new normal. This means we must allow ourselves time and energy to grieve, but we must also allow ourselves time to let go of the loss so we can function. Some people try to pretend the loss never occurred. Others continue to obsess on it. For the long journey of grieving, we must find a middle ground. We must not pretend it didn't happen, nor should we obsess on the loss for any longer than necessary. The best path is to build grieving rituals or routines into our new normal, such as attending a support group, seeing a grief counselor, journaling, reading about grieving, honoring the loss, finding a meaning and purpose in the loss, building a safe support system, and other ways to allow ourselves to work through the pain of the loss on a regular basis without obsessing on it. We each must discover the specifics of what works best for us, but it will require a delicate balancing act between working on accepting the past and choosing to return to the present. Grieving can be like walking a tightrope. If we lean too far either way, we can fall into unresolved grief. In summary, grief work involves two seemingly opposing tasks. One requires working through the pain and meaninglessness triggered by the loss, while the other involves finding our way back to life with new meaning and purpose as a result of the loss. Transforming the senselessness of traumatic loss into sacred pain lies at the very heart of grieving. An elderly couple had recently lost their only child. They were devastated and their hearts were completely broken. Why had she died so young? How could God explain this? How would they live without her? They searched for these answers with each other, with friends, and in their prayers. They found no answers. They finally went to an old woman who was known for her wisdom and compassion. With tears in their eyes, they begged her to reveal how they could relieve themselves of their endless and horrible suffering. The old woman touched them gently and replied, "I am unable to remove your pain. I can only teach you how to make it sacred." If you found this video helpful, please click the thumbs up button. And if you want to hear more from me, then subscribe to my channel, Counselor Carl. I will be publishing a new video every other weekend. And if you'd like help in learning to make your grief sacred, then visit my website, serenityoonlinetherapy.com, where you can learn more about me and the online services I provide. And finally, keep paying attention to your life. Until next time.